So, we all know that historically schools have not done a great job in promoting education. The traditional schooling system has failed to account for individuality, individual difference between students and just humans in general. They have not done a great job of making learning the goal of school, and that was for multiple different reasons. Politics, just time, the specific time in history, philosophy of different schools, and so forth. But there's not really a use of complaining about it. So I thought that I would run a little thought experiment. What if I were to create my own education system? And immediately that task becomes very daunting to do it alone. So I thought instead of doing it alone, I would do it with others that would be interested in that. So that sounds like something that you would want to even talk to others about, just join the Discord that's going to be in the description, and we'll talk about it. But anyway, the first thing that I thought I would address was that whole individual differences thing. But with it, I immediately ran into a brick wall. The brick wall is simply the overwhelming amount of things that constitute individual differences. And that wall is kind of caused by how unclear it is where human commonalities end and individual differences begin. So while I'm trying to understand that, I thought that I would start with things that we would, at least all as human beings, understand to be individual differences. And the first thing I thought that would be is your past experiences and how that affects your current understanding. Because everybody's situation is different. As an example of that, let's take a classroom. Let's say that you're looking at two students and they've went to the same pre-K, they went to the same kindergarten, they've went to the same elementary school. And let's say they're in middle school now. And in middle school, they're taking a math class. Now, even though they've been to the exact same classes with the exact same teachers, with the same classmates, you know for a fact that they will have different understandings of the subject. To assume otherwise would be, frankly, insane. So, knowing all of that, how in the world do you account for it inside a classroom, inside an education system? Well, to answer that, let's look at how people even come to a shared understanding. On the most basic level, you and I would be talking to each other about a topic, and we would first say what we mean, what we think about it, what we understand it individually, and then try to reconcile the two. And once we come to an understanding of each other's viewpoints, and we would apply that understanding to that specific topic, we would then more or less be on the same page. Now, you actually have to do this with quite a few more things than you might expect in a classroom. So if you're in an Algebra 2 class and you're talking about something that you learned in Algebra 1, it might actually be better to make sure that everybody's on the same page first before assuming that they are. However, that's not to say that there are not many times when you should assume that something is already learned, that something is already understood on that kind of level of where everybody is on the same page. For example, if you're in a calculus class, you should probably assume that people more or less understand what a variable is. Now, to be fair, I've been in college classrooms where people do not know what a variable is, so Okay, all that to say, you need a point of shared understanding in order to move forward in your exploration with the subject. But let's take even a further step back and see what prerequisites do you need to even try to establish a point of shared understanding. Well, first of all, you need a similar way of communication, or hopefully the same way of communication. Which sounds obvious, I know. It's like, okay, let's say we speak English and we just talk to each other, right? But I don't only mean language. I mean, every subject kind of has its own language. For example, and okay, let's start with language. In Russian, there's a word, And there's a word just that's called sabaka. Sabaka means dog, but if you say sabaka and the other person speaks English and doesn't know like a Russian, it will mean absolutely nothing to them because that sound combination, that word does not exist in English. Similarly, if you're learning math and you all of a sudden try to use a symbol that does not exist in mathematics, it will be meaningless. So when trying to communicate with someone, when trying to achieve a point of shared understanding, you have to be able to speak the same language no matter what subject it is. So then tying that up, it makes sense if you do not speak the same language, you cannot achieve a shared point of understanding. Therefore, starts to make sense why teachers would make you memorize definitions, because if they thought that you had the same definition they did, then you would be able to communicate and come to a point of shared understanding. I thought that the best way to illustrate this would be to draw an example from an experience I had 2 or 3 years ago, which to me perfectly demonstrated what happens when a teacher and a student do not have the same shared understanding. I had to shadow a 5th grade classroom, and the teacher was kind enough and trusted me enough to let me work with the troubled groups in each class. And in the math classroom, there was this one girl that specifically just struggled more than everybody else. Now, this girl, Emma, she had trouble with column multiplication and long division. And this was troubling for multiple reasons, one of which is she should have learned it 2 years ago, but she should have mastered it by 5th grade. And yet she didn't. So we worked on it with her tirelessly. And every time we would work on it, she would get frustrated, she would struggle with it, but eventually she would get it. But then she would go home, come back, and it's like nothing ever happened. And it went like this all the way until the penultimate day of school. I was working with Emma that day again, and she was getting frustrated, obviously. And as she was getting more frustrated, I was getting more frustrated. And then I did the thing that no teacher should do in my situation, and I lost my temper. I took her whiteboard, I took her marker, and I asked her to do a problem. I think it was something like 12 times 26. And she reached for the whiteboard, but I took it back and asked her to do it in her head. Now, my intention was to help her learn how to estimate numbers because her answers have been so far off, it just seemed like a useful skill to have. But she looked at me, realized that I was serious, sat back in her chair, and thought for a good 10-15 seconds. And then looked at me and gave me the right answer, to which I was just blown away. We just worked for a semester on this thing, and she wasn't even close. But then on this second to last day of school, she did it in her head. I couldn't figure it out at all. So for the rest of that day together, we were trying to figure out what was happening. And we figured out that Emma was taking column multiplication, and in her head, she was doing it from left to right, which is exactly the opposite of what we do on paper, because we do that from right to left. It's counterintuitive. So she just didn't connect the two and couldn't understand that it was the exact same process, the exact same results, rather, but just a different process. Now, to end this off, I do want to emphasize one thing, and that is that this does not only apply in school settings. It applies to anywhere where you want to connect with another person, solve a problem, to even understand each other when it comes to any of your interaction in our great world. So a small example is cooking. Let's say that you and your partner, you and your friend, family, whoever is cooking together, and you just think that one dish is amazing and the other dish is not. What the problem there is that you're not speaking the same language. you do not have the same understanding of what constitutes good, what tastes in that dish should constitute as tasting good. So if you could come to that same understanding, that same language, and then come to the same understanding, then you would be able to agree on it or disagree on it, knowing what an objective viewpoint on it would be. Thank you for watching the video. As I already mentioned, you can join the Discord in order to talk about this video, about learning, or anything remotely related to education. The next video will most likely be about individual differences, so stay tuned for that.